Today we have a 2-in-1. The first is going to be the 10 most disappointing fantasy novels I've ever read, but it's also combined with what I call the holy trinity of fantasy. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Let's have a hot takes discussion on the most disappointing fantasy novels that I've ever read. I forgot to say it, so if you like this video, please like it and also subscribe. Thank you. So before we get into the 10 books, let's put out a quick disclaimer. Just because I was disappointed by one of these novels does not mean I dislike the author. And in fact, in many of these cases, they're some of my favorite authors. I think that a disappointing novel is almost worse than a bad novel because you expect so much from this author, and so you're so excited, and then you're like, oh, that's just not what I wanted. And that doesn't even mean that the book is like a bad book. It just means that it wasn't what you were looking for sometimes. I'm an author. I've actually seen a video where my book was on a top 10 worst books someone read during an entire year. So I understand that sometimes this can be a little painful. I'm going to try and keep it cordial, but like I said, most of these authors are some of my favorite authors. Now, before we begin, I want to just issue a quick spoiler warning. I'm going to name the book and the series and the author before I get into any spoilers, and I'm going to try and put timestamps in the description below. I haven't done that yet, and I haven't actually looked up how, so there may or may not be time description. You'll just have to check. I'm hoping I can get it to work. If not, I apologize. If I do, awesome. But if I don't, I will at least leave an image of the book on the video for as long as I talk about it. And that way you'll be able to skip ahead to the next book if you'd like. So let's get into number 10, shall we? Number 10 is going to be Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. It's the third book in the Farseer trilogy. Now, Robin Hobb is an author that I just discovered last year, and I have already named her one of my favorite authors ever. But I went in blind. I've heard so much about Robin Hobb that I wanted to just go in. I knew that I'd probably like the books based on what everyone was saying, so I just wanted to go in and start reading it. Once I started reading it, I just got addicted. The first two books I absolutely loved. They were fantastic. But book 3 had a few issues for me. And while it was still a 4-star read, and I still really enjoyed it, and Robin Hobb is still a master writer, and I really liked this book, I had a couple issues with it, and I think part of it is because I went in blind. So the first issue is that the ending of the novel doesn't resolve everything in the trilogy. Totally fine, because this is the first trilogy in a series of 16 books. Now, when I went in, I knew this was a 16-book series. I did not know how closely related the series apparently are. So when I read that first trilogy, I was really expecting a solid resolution, and when I didn't get it, it was disappointing to me because while I was reading the book, I wanted that to happen. When I finished the book, I was like, damn, I wish I knew what happened here, but I understand apparently the rest of the series kind of is continuous, I guess. So it was disappointing for that part in the moment. But there's a second factor that was really disappointing as well that doesn't have anything to do with being in a 16-book series. And that's that we spend 600-ish pages of the book traveling. And while this travel is interspersed with like really cool and interesting scenes and moments and side stories, it takes a really long time for our main character Fitz to get to where he's going. An almost unnecessary amount of time. And like I said, Robin Hobb is a fantastic writer. So it's still an enjoyable journey, but wow, it took so long, and I'm not really the biggest fan of traveling forever. So that book kind of went down a bit compared to the first two. It was still a great read, but for me, it struggled with that. Book number 9 is kind of a special circumstance because book number 9 I read when I was a senior in high school, I think. And that is the Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind, but specifically book 2, Stone of Tears, I think it's called. This book was terrible. But the first book I really enjoyed. As a kid, as an adult, I have no idea what I would think about that book now. It's been so long. I've heard so many bad things about the author just plagiarizing almost and stealing a bunch of stuff. I don't really know if any of that's true. I don't. I never proceeded with the series, and it's been so long since I read it, so I don't have any opinion on that. However, book 1 I thought was great. I thought the main character Richard was compelling. I thought his love interest Colin, Callan. I don't remember her name, but it's Kahlan, I think. Um, anyway, I love their dynamic. This whole story of the first book I thought was great. It had me feeling things. It was just interesting. The characters were good, even though there was not many of them. And the story, although sort of tropey, I really enjoyed it. Perhaps that was a more mature book than other fantasy novels I'd read at the time, and that might have been why I enjoyed the first book so much. But when I eagerly checked out the second one from the library, I started reading it, and I think I just abandoned the book in about 200 or 300 pages. I don't remember exactly. And the reason for that is because the second book was retreading the first storyline almost event by event. Someone got separated from someone else. Someone got tortured. And then in the second book, the other person got tortured, I think. And it was also, they had the love story going on. And the whole time, it almost felt like they were doing everything possible to stay apart from one another. And then lamenting it and wondering why they had to be apart. And the whole time, you're just like, but you really don't have to be. So it's hard for me to go on about this book. I haven't read it in so long. I just remember being just destroyed by how awful book 2 was in comparison to how much I enjoyed book 1. Book number 8 is actually 2 different books by one author, or actually a series and a standalone book. And that's actually from my favorite author, Joe Abercrombie. And so let's talk about the series first. And the series is his deviation from the first law. I think originally it was marketed as a young adult series. I don't know if it still is. It was surprisingly a bit mature for what I would think a normal young adult book would be. But then again, today I know that young adult is slapped on everything that has, a younger protagonist. So perhaps it is young adult in today's market. I don't know. But that's the Shattered Sea trilogy, and it kind of takes place in this Norse-inspired world. And when it comes to books, that's not really my favorite thing. I think I just don't like a lot of the Norse names. A lot of them are very similar. I don't recall that being an issue in Abercrombie's world, but the culture is just, it's not my favorite thing to read about. I really did like some of the Norse-inspired TV shows that I've seen, but I think that for TV shows, it's something I can digest, but when you're reading about it and you're reading about all the Norse gods and the really closely similar names that are difficult to pronounce, it's not exactly my favorite thing, and the whole time I read that series, I was just like, oh man, can we please go back to the first law, because I like that so much more. And then the second novel by Joe Abercrombie is Red Country. Now, I know I already warned about spoilers early on, but this is really going to spoil the whole First Law trilogy and also Red Country. So if you don't want those spoilers, I'm really going heavy on those now. So skip forward, because this will just ruin everything. So Logan Ninefingers is one of everyone's favorite characters in the First Law. Now, controversially, I fucking hate the character, and I think he's really boring, and I don't understand why people like him, because he's just a barbarian who's basically invincible, and he has a couple really good, quips and one-liners and thoughts, and really good, catchy phrases, which is awesome. I love that part. But his character as a whole, one of my least favorite characters in the whole series. I know that's super controversial, but I always hated him. So that's kind of why I didn't like Red Country. It was all about him. Now, it doesn't say that it's him, and it doesn't really hint that it's him until I think like halfway to three-quarters of the way through the book. I don't recall. And I'm not even sure if they ever actually name him in that book. It's been a while since I've read it. But by the end of the book, you know who he is. And while I was reading that book the whole time, I suspected it was him. And Red Country, as just a story without Logan Nine Fingers, wasn't necessarily my thing. There was a lot of travel in it. It felt kind of uneventful to me. I didn't really gravitate towards the main character. That's no surprise since, it is Logan Nine Fingers. And so I was just really happy to be done with that book. I also don't like I might be wrong. It's been so long since I've read the series, but I think that Logan Nine Fingers is hinted at dying at the end of the first law. And then in Red Country, he's resurrected. Now, I tell this really funny story about the first time I read The Blade itself. And it was when I had almost decided, like, I'm done reading books because I'd been so frustrated with the fantasy genre that I had gotten to a point as a kid, a teenager, I think I was 19 at the time. I'd gotten to the point where almost every single fantasy book was like, I could tell you what was going to happen, and then it would happen. Admittedly, this is before I discovered like Game of Thrones and some other awesome, unpredictable stories. But at the time, it was like Aragon I read, and I can't remember what else, but it was just a slew of really predictable stories that I just couldn't take anymore. And my friend that I roomed with in college, he was like, listen, I just read this book and you should read it. It's spectacular. And I was like, okay, cool. Let me borrow it. So I borrowed The Blade itself. And the first chapter is Logan Nine Fingers, barbarian, invincible, boring fighter, falling off a cliff and not dying. And I swear to God, I took the book, and we were in a dorm room, so we had these bunk beds, and I threw it across the room onto his bed, and I said, I'm not reading that trash. What the hell is wrong with you? And he said, why? And I said, the first book, or the first chapter is so fucking predictable. Obviously he lived, he fell off a cliff. It's just, I don't want more of this. And he said, no, you need to trust me. Read the second chapter. And so I did, and that was Glocta's introduction, I think. And from then on, I was hooked, and I just pretended that Logan was unimportant. So I almost didn't read my favorite author of all time because of that first chapter. Fun times. I just really liked everything in the First Law trilogy, or series rather, is more than a trilogy, except for Red Country. And that's because it really was just more Logan, who just got revived again, who didn't die again, and it just bored me, really. And that's why Red Country was not really my thing. Let's move on. We're now at number 7. This one might be a bit controversial. I've seen a lot of people list these books as their favorites, and I've seen some other people list them as terrible. So, I guess we'll see what you guys think. But number 7 for me is the Stormlight Archive. The third and fourth books, Oathbringer and Rhythm of War. Now, the first 2 books in this series I thought were really, really good. And then Oathbringer happened, and I thought Oathbringer was just okay. I thought it was a significant step down from where we were. Everything about Dalinar in that book I thought was great, but every other POV I thought was significantly worse than their stories in the first 2 books. And then you get to Rhythm of War. There wasn't a POV I was ever excited to return to in Rhythm of War. Everyone was very boring in that book. And I think the biggest problem with Rhythm of War is that within the first 100 pages, maybe, the only villain that was left in that book is killed, if I remember correctly. And then you have no villains, really. You have just a lot of people living and coexisting and wondering what's going to happen with the other faction. I can't remember what they're called, but this book really expands on them. And like there is some fighting that happens, but and I think they occupy the main base of the main characters or whatever. That's where Kaladin is, I think. But instead of fighting, Kaladin is just going through this like PTSD storyline. And I don't mind the idea of exploring this in a book, maybe, but when the whole book is exploring it and he doesn't do anything, and the whole time he's thinking, I should be doing something, but I just don't want to or can't, it's just weird, and it's boring. It gets very old, and I'm not trying to say that PTSD should be exciting. I think there's a good point in exploring it, but 1,000 pages of it kind of gets a little stagnant after a while. We're reading these books for things to happen, and Rhythm of War really didn't have anything happen. I honestly was just slogging through that book. But I've seen other people say that Rhythm of War is one of their favorite books they've ever read. So not everyone's going to agree here, of course, and that's okay. Number 6 is kind of a bit of an oddity because it's not necessarily a book. So everyone knows, or most people know, that I'm a big Harry Potter fan. I grew up with it. I really liked it when I was a kid. I still really like it. But number 6 is Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, the play that was written by John Tiffany, Jack Thorne, and it says J.K. Rowling, but as far as I'm aware, she just authorized the writing of it. I don't know if she participated in it. It doesn't really matter. The book or the play is really bad. Just feels like a destruction of characters that we already knew. It's not really a surprise there. That seems to happen a lot with big franchises. I don't know if it's we need to do something different or we need to shake things up. I don't really know why that's a thing, but it just doesn't land well to me. And Harry Potter in this book is like the biggest douche. It just doesn't make sense. And his son is like the most annoying character ever. And the story just isn't that great. And I might also be incredibly biased here because I hate reading plays just in general. Just any play. I hate the format of reading them. I don't like going to plays. I don't like anything about plays. And that might be a me thing that just, I was conditioned not to like this book from the very beginning. But man, even the story and the characters, I just hated every single part of it. And I don't really have much to say about it because if we're being honest, I don't remember anything about it. I read it in, a day and a half maybe, over 2 afternoons. And then when I finished it, I totally expunged the experience from my mind because it was that stupid. All right, we're in the top 5 now. And I think that my opinions are going to start maybe offending people a bit more than maybe the first 5 did. And if I do, I apologize. They're just books. They're just things I didn't enjoy. And if you enjoyed them, I think that's awesome. I think that's great. We can have our differing opinions and we can still be friends, I hope. So number 5 is the 3rd book in the Gentleman Bastard series, The Republic of Thieves. And the reason why I didn't like this book is because it focused on a play. Which, if you skipped the last book, I hate plays. And the idea of having a performance and maybe doing some sort of scam or something with it's not a storyline I dislike. Final Fantasy IX started out with that, and it was actually kind of fun to play. But it didn't last the entire book. And I just felt like a lot of the story got lost in this book. You had the romancing between Locke Lamora and I forgot her name. His love interest, is it Sabine? Ooh, I might be wrong there. But it's the girl that he's, loved. And I actually really liked that part of it. But everything outside of him chasing her romantically, I just didn't think it landed. There wasn't really much happening. and a lot of it was just slow and boring. And I really wanted to get back to like what the first two books were doing with like really interesting story and scams and plots and stuff. And this one just really seemed to slow down and really focus on putting on a play. And I don't know, it didn't do it for me. Now I really liked the first two books, and I'm really excited for book number 4. If it ever comes out, it keeps getting delayed, and it happens. It's not a big deal. I would like to read it sometime though. But if number 4 is more like number 3 instead of 1 and 2, the series might just not be for me. I guess we'll see how much I like number 4 when it comes out. So number 4 is actually the first book that I finished reading and immediately went online and posted a scathing review. It's actually the only book I've ever done that for, because I've never felt that impassioned before, I guess you could say. And now as an indie author, now that I'm more familiar with how easy it is for authors to see their reviews, how often they might look or might not look, I don't know. I just don't, I don't want to ever rail on anybody's work that's still alive. I think, if the author's died, it's not really going to personally offend anyone in the same way, so I'm a little bit more open to that. But if the author's still alive, I'm not trying to like make an enemy of them, of course. So that review that I referenced, I actually had never posted it on Amazon or Goodreads. Back then I didn't have a Goodreads account, and I didn't go through the process of posting on Amazon. I actually saw an Orbit Books advertisement on Facebook for the book, and I posted it there. So I'm sure that Orbit Books immediately deleted it, but it had satisfied my anger. And now this is going to get into full spoilers for the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. And before I get into that, I do want to just mention that I really liked the Night Angel series, and I really liked the first 3 books of Lightbringer. So if you can do the math there, that means the last 2 in Lightbringer are the books I'm mentioning here. The first one is the Blood Mirror, and the second one is, or the 4th book is the Blood Mirror, and the 5th book is the Burning Light. Now, the Blood Mirror, when that book first came out, originally, I believe the series, Lightbringer, was supposed to be 4 books. And so this was supposed to be the 4th book, and I was super excited for it. But then, not long before it came out, I believe it was announced that it was actually going to be split into 2 books, and it was going to be a 5-book series. Now, that actually had worried me, because often when that happens, the books kind of turn into these sluggish, boring books. And so I was really apprehensive when I heard that change, but I was also really excited because I really liked the world and I really liked the story. But the funny thing is, I was right. The Blood Mirror was very, very boring. It felt like a very long book for not much reason. I didn't feel like much happened in it. It just felt like we were delaying the story until book 5. So that book, I was like, it's, it felt like a random filler book, which happens in series sometimes. So I didn't hate the book. I didn't like it either. It was fine. But then we got to the Burning Light, and the whole series, there's this deity. I forgot what they're called. I think it starts with an O, or Orholim or something. So there's this deity. And the whole time, the book to me, and this might just be my own religious bias coming in, which I'm actually an atheist. So when I read a book that has religion and a god in it, if the god isn't immediately kind of like proven to be real, I just assume, probably from my own atheistic viewpoint, that there isn't actually a god and that they're worshiping nothing and they just like believe in this god, but the god doesn't actually exist. So in the Blood Mirror, when the god actually is like shown to be real and just kind of appears, that really ruined a lot of the book for me and the series. But I could have been okay with that if it wasn't written in a way that I thought was ridiculous, because the god becomes a physical being and the main character has to fight the god, which makes no sense because they're on the same side. So they're fighting and fighting and talking and fighting and talking and fighting, and this is the whole like climactic battle here while the whole world is getting destroyed. And eventually, the main character beats the god. And the god is like, oh, you know what? Actually, I'm going to fix everything for you. And then it's just ridiculous because the main character flies across the world with this god, and the god basically snaps his fingers and fixes everything. And there's no complications or punishments, and no one dies. And it's just really an annoying, just here's how everything's fixed, and now we can live our lives happily. But I think what's even worse is at the end of the book, there's a link to Brent Weeks' website. And this link says, I think it's just a link. And if you go to the link, the website says something like, congratulations, you found the true ending of the series. And it was actually everyone in the book getting poisoned and dying at the hands of another villain. I can't remember his name, but it's one of the main characters' father that they have this like weird relationship throughout the whole book. And that ending was like, oh my god, this is brilliant. Why that wasn't actually in the book is beyond me, because it would have fixed a lot of the issues I had with the book and the series as a whole. But, you know, I liked Night Angel. I didn't like Lightbringer. Now Brent Weeks is apparently returning to Night Angel, and so I'm hoping that I'm gonna really like that book. But who knows? We'll see. I haven't read Night Angel since I was very young, so I'm hoping to like it. All right, we've made it to the top 3, and this is where I'm gonna lose a lot of you, I think. This is what I call the Holy Trinity of fantasy. What's the Holy Trinity? You'll find out as I go through the 3 books, but I just wanted to have this brief conversation about how I'm in some reading groups on Facebook, and these 3 franchises have the biggest fan base. And if anyone says anything bad about any of these books, people hate you. So, and I don't like any of them. So here we go. It's going to be fun. I hope you guys can understand that it's just my opinion on books. We can, still read and be happy. We can still be friends. My opinion on books doesn't affect you. Your opinion on books doesn't affect me. And let's get into it, I guess. And before we do, I just want to say I'm sorry. But these are just my honest opinions. So let's get into it. All right, so number 3 on the list, and the first pillar in the Holy Trinity of fantasy, is The Wheel of Time. I tried to read this book, or I tried to read the whole series. I was really interested in reading a 14-book series, and I think it's 14 books. And I was super, super excited to start it. And the first book, it started okay. And I finished the first book, and I thought, wow, that was a really, tropey, kind of boring mess. It just felt really cliche. And, I guess that's probably how fantasy was written. I think that book came out in the early 90s. And a lot of books from that period were exactly like that. So it's definitely a product of its time, and I just didn't really like it. But I decided to try and push forward, and I started reading the second book. And I ended up not finishing it. It just kind of became more of the same. There were some storylines that I really enjoyed. I can't begin to tell you who. I think it was a girl that was at like the magical school. It's been so long I can't really remember. But I really enjoyed that part. I could not stand the 3 main characters, Matt, Rand, and is it Perrin? I think it was those 3. I just couldn't get into it. I really tried, and I actually, out of the 3 Holy Trinity series that we're going to talk about, this one's the most digestible. It was easy to read. I appreciated that. It's just, it was too tropey and too predictable for me. And so I just, I found the first couple of books to be pretty slow, and everyone online is like posting about how there's this giant slog of 3 books like later on in the series, and I was like, wait, this isn't the slog? I thought this would be the slog, and it gets slower than what I'm reading now. I'm just not into that. So I ended up quitting the series, and that's okay. I was really hoping for a lot of enjoyment out of it because it was so long, and I really like to read and enjoy a really long book or series, but it just wasn't for me. And I also I really wanted to give the show a shot too, but after seeing the reception, I ended up bowing out of that. I've heard mixed things about it, but you know, I just assumed that the show was going to be the same kind of problematic issue, like have the same sort of problematic issues that I had with the books. So I ended up not trying it. There's so many shows out there. The books, you know, I think it depends on if you like standard epic fantasy, and uh, as we're going to discuss in like the next series, it's just not really my thing. I like to have a more realistic, more gritty type of fantasy where uh, people can die, people can be hurt. I did hear that that happens a bit more later on in the series, but if like most of the series is kind of the cleaner fantasy where it's really predictable, really, you know, very normative of epic fantasy, it wasn't really my thing. And I think that out of the Holy Trinity, I enjoyed this one the most. But let's move on to the second one. All right, the second pillar of the Holy Trinity, and the second most disappointing novel that I've read, and I feel terrible saying this because I know I'm going to get absolutely crucified. This is the one. This is the heavy hitter. It's Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings. Yep, by Tolkien. And as a kid, I watched the movies. At the time, I thought they were amazing, but to be fair, there just wasn't any other fantasy TV show or movie like it with the quality, and it was just awesome to watch. Nowadays, my opinion on the film series is controversially not that high. I just, it's fine. It's a great world, and the story I just don't like that much, and the characters I'm not a big fan of. I wouldn't mind some expansion into the world if maybe it was some different stories, and I know that's kind of a hot take. I know Rings of Power came out. I tried to watch that. I really wanted to like it, but I couldn't get past the first episode. The writing of the dialogue and the main character, it drove me nuts. But back to the story, the books. Lord of the Rings is one of those franchises that has so many fans, and to like a weird obsession. I think for how old this story is, I'm surprised at how many people still go to bat for it. The fans can get really, really, really mad, like really angry. I've had someone tell me once that because I wasn't a fan of Tolkien, I could not write a good book, that I would just a terrible person, and that no one should read anything I wrote because I didn't write something inspired by the grandfather of fantasy, so to speak. But the truth is, fantasy was around long before Tolkien, and Tolkien didn't invent the genre. If Tolkien hadn't have written the Lord of the Rings, we would have had fantasy still. It definitely probably would have evolved in like a different way. And so I want to make sure that everyone knows I agree Tolkien should get credited a lot for things like Dungeons and Dragons, which has influenced fantasy a lot, has a huge influence in that. And a lot of major fantasy authors, Tolkien is their number one inspiration. So yeah, Tolkien definitely bleeds into a lot of the fantasy that we know today. But I think it's a little disingenuous to attribute the entire genre to him. That being said, I think that he did some amazing things. There's a lot of cool races that he really brought into the limelight. Really created a lot of cool stuff. But the series, man, I tried reading it several times. When I was a kid, I was so interested into the movies, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to read this series of books. And I couldn't get through the first book. And I tried reading them again as an adult. And I think I got to right when Strider reveals to the hobbits that he's Aragorn, I think. I can't remember. It's been a long time, and I'm not like a Middle Earth savant, so I don't actually remember the story 100%. But I think it was right around then. It was just such a boring book to me. I don't think that is necessarily a Tolkien issue. I thought Tom Bombadil was super boring, but uh, I think just from a writing standpoint, I tend to really dislike anything written before 1990. Maybe I prefer a much more modern writing style. You can call me simple. That's fine. Uh, that's okay. I just don't like the older style of writing. And so I think that's a major reason why I don't like The Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of chapters full of description, and people say there's no chapters that are just description. Yes, there is. It goes on and on. And if that's your thing, that's cool. For me, I don't really want to linger on the description of anything for longer than a few sentences, and even then, that might be too much for me. I want quick and simple and get to the story, get to it. I don't need to see the entire tavern room described to me, especially if we're just walking through it and we're not actually hanging out in it. I don't need to know what the entire forest looks like the entire journey. And again, if that's your thing, that's totally great. It was just too much for me. I don't like that much description. I thought the story was very, and this is of course the case that it's very cliche, but it was also written. I don't remember the 50s. It was a long time ago, and so obviously, like anything written in the 50s is going to be considered cliche now. And sure, you can argue and say, but it wasn't cliche at the time, and that's probably true. But it's still a cliche now, and I have a hard time separating that. Actually, I have an impossible time separating that. I don't care if it was original at the time, if I know what's going to happen and I can predict what's going to happen, and everyone has that kind of invincibility and that hum ho jolly good attitude type thing. It's just not for me. And the movies really highlighted that aspect too, and I think that's part of the reason why I don't like the movies all that much. And that's okay. It's just I prefer other things. So let's move on to number one. So the first book on my list of the most disappointing reads, and the last pillar of the Holy Trinity of fantasy books. That's Malazan, or Malazan, I think, by Steven Erikson. I'm going to call it Malazan because that's just what I've called it, and if I'm saying the wrong thing, I apologize. I think the official one is actually Malazan, but I don't know. So I'm just going to say Malazan, and if you don't like it, I'm sorry. It's just what I've always called it, and it's just going to roll off my tongue while I'm not even thinking about it. So this series obviously is always kind of a joke in a lot of groups and places because it's always the first thing that everyone suggests when someone asks what they should read, despite it being one of the most popular series ever. It's kind of funny how often it's recommended. So because it was recommended so often, and I heard it was like one of the darkest, one of the greatest books ever, I had to give it a try, right? And it sounded like it hit all the things I really liked, right? Multi POV, apparently really grimdark, a big series. I like all these things, and I was super excited to get into it. So I ordered Gardens of the Moon, and I started reading it. I think I got 150 pages in, and I was like, okay, this is not for me, and I got rid of the book. I think I donated it to a library or Salvation Army or something. I don't remember. So I got rid of the book and I moved on in life. And maybe like 2 or 3, maybe 5 years later, I kept seeing it pop up again. And I was like, man, I need to try this again. Maybe I was just too dumb back in the day. Maybe I was younger. I'm older now. A lot of people say it drops you in the middle of things, and you're going to be confused, but you'll get it. And I think that I have read plenty of complicated books in terms of story and characters and stuff. But when it comes to like the prose, if that's complicated, I think that I'm just out. And Malazan is one of those series that like I just didn't understand. I finished the first book. I bought the first book again. I read the whole thing, and I put that book down. And I realized I hadn't actually understood a single damn thing that happened in that book. So it's not an Erickson problem. I don't think it's a me problem. I just didn't comprehend a damn thing that happened. Sure, he could have written a book that was easier to understand, I guess. And so I suppose I could blame the author for the way he wrote it. But I don't think that's fair because people write in different ways. People have different desires. And for me, I think it's just a me problem. I didn't understand it, and for the biggest problem for me was that there was a lot of unexplained things that he doesn't really ever explain, or he does explain it once, maybe, or he'll give it a different name. So, for example, I don't remember anything about this book, but for example, I have a cup of water here. Okay, there's ice in it. You can hear the ice, and Erickson does this thing where he will say, so this right here is actually going to be called a, I don't know, red blood bag. And this is a terrible analogy, but just go with it. So maybe one time in the book he says, this red blood bag is a cup of water. Okay? Now, if you don't catch that right then and there, and you don't remember that, then for the rest of the book, whenever red blood bag pops up, you're going to say, I have no fucking idea what that is. I don't remember it. And that's what happens with this book for me anyway. And it happened many, many, many different times with a lot of different terms and a lot of different places and a lot of different objects and stuff. And I think there's a glossary. And, but I'm one of those people who I'm not really going to go back to the glossary for two reasons. One, I often forget it's there. And two, I don't want to flip to the back of the book and spoil anything. I've done that before and I always get angry at myself. But even if the glossary was in the front of the book, I honestly don't know that I would have been able to pick up on much that happened. I really was that confused during the whole book. And people say, it starts out confusing, but it gets better. You'll understand it. You just need to be willing to be confused. I don't know. I've read the entire first book. I came away super confused. I don't know what else I could have done to understand it. People said there was a wiki online that I should have gone on. And if I have to do research to understand a book, I'm not enjoying that book. Most of the time I'm reading, it's like in my bed before I go to sleep. I don't really want to be researching different things on the phone or on my computer. I just want to chill out and read, right? I don't really want to have to think about it too hard. I'm not in English class anymore in college. I'm just relaxing. So that's why Malazan didn't really work for me. And for me, it's just Malazan was a me problem. And in terms of the Holy Trinity, I know that those are three huge series, and I truly do apologize. They're not for me, and I get that they're some of the most beloved franchises out there. I hope that you guys all continue to enjoy them. I hope that you're able to understand why I don't like them and why it's okay that I don't like them. And I'm not shitting on them. I just wanted to put out why these books were disappointing for me. And that's what this channel is. It's about hot takes on popular things. And these things I just didn't like. They didn't vibe with me. They are certainly hot takes. But that's why I'm here. I will always say how I feel about things. I'll always be honest, but I really try not to be an asshole about it. And so, I like to go back and forth and be honest. And so I hope in the comments down below, maybe you guys can let me know what you like, what you don't like, and maybe offer some opinions on my takes. As long as you're not a dick, I welcome it. So thank you. I really appreciate anyone who made it this far.